Bumpy Johnson's razor, how he killed 30 men without using guns. The year was 1932, and 8-year-old Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was about to learn his first lesson in the art of invisible warfare. Standing in the doorway of his grandmother's Harlem apartment, he watched as 3 Italian men in expensive suits cornered his neighbor, Mrs. Washington, demanding protection money she didn't have. What happened next would shape the legend of the man who would become known as Bumpy Johnson, and it involved something far deadlier than any gun ever manufactured. Young Ellsworth reached into his pocket, pulled out his grandfather's straight razor, and in one fluid motion that seemed to defy physics, he flicked it across the lead Italian's Achilles tendon. The man dropped like a stone, screaming, as his 2 companions dragged him away, blood trailing behind them on the brownstone steps. Mrs. Washington never paid protection money again, and Bumpy Johnson had discovered his signature weapon. But this wasn't just about a razor. This was about understanding that true power doesn't come from the loudest bang or the biggest gun. True power comes from precision, timing, and the ability to strike fear into men's hearts with nothing more than the whisper of steel against skin. Over the next 30 years, that razor would claim 30 lives, and not a single shot would be fired. The FBI files on Bumpy Johnson contain over 2,000 pages, but what they don't tell you is how a man could control all of Harlem, command respect from the most dangerous criminals in America, and eliminate his enemies without ever needing the crude brutality of firearms. They don't tell you about the razor, and they certainly don't tell you about the night in 1962 when Bumpy Johnson proved that the most dangerous weapon in the world isn't made of gunpowder and lead, but of carbon steel and absolute precision. The legend of Bumpy's razor began long before he became the undisputed king of Harlem. It started in the back room of Charlie Small's barber shop on 125th Street, where 12-year-old Ellsworth learned that a straight razor wasn't just a tool for shaving. Charlie Small had been a barber in the trenches of World War I, and he'd seen what a skilled man could do with a blade when bullets ran out. Every day after school, young Ellsworth would sit in that barber shop, watching Charlie's hands move with surgical precision as he worked the razor across men's faces, never once drawing blood unless he intended to. Charlie noticed the boy's fascination and began teaching him, not just how to hold the razor, but how to read a man's pulse through his skin, how to find the exact pressure points that would drop a grown man in seconds, how to move the blade so quickly and quietly that a victim wouldn't even realize they'd been cut until they tried to stand. By the time Ellsworth was 16, he could perform what Charlie called the Harlem Whisper, a technique so precise that he could sever a man's carotid artery with a motion so subtle that witnesses would swear they never saw a weapon. The victim would simply start talking, then gradually grow pale, then collapse, appearing to die of natural causes. It was during this time that young Ellsworth earned his nickname Bumpy, not from any physical deformity as many believed, but from his ability to bump into someone on the street and leave them bleeding out 3 blocks later, with no one the wiser about what had happened. The police couldn't investigate what they couldn't prove, and you can't prove a murder weapon that fits in a man's vest pocket and looks like nothing more than an old-fashioned shaving implement. The first of Bumpy's 30 confirmed kills happened in 1934, when he was just 27 years old. Vincent Torino, a lieutenant in the Lucchese family, had been muscling in on the numbers racket in East Harlem, specifically targeting elderly black women who couldn't fight back. Torino was smart, never carrying a gun, always surrounded by bodyguards, always in public places where violence seemed impossible. But Bumpy Johnson understood something that Vincent Torino didn't. The most public places are often the most private, because no one expects anything to happen there. It was a Tuesday afternoon at the Apollo Theater, during the matinee showing of a jazz revue. Torino sat in his usual seat, 5th row center, flanked by 2 bodyguards. Bumpy approached from behind, moving through the darkened theater like smoke. As the band reached the crescendo of their opening number, drowning out any sound, Bumpy's razor found the gap between Torino's collar and his neck, severing the spinal cord in one precise motion. Vincent Torino died instantly, but his body remained upright, held in place by the theater seat, his eyes still open, appearing to watch the show. His bodyguards didn't realize their boss was dead until intermission, when they tried to wake him for a cigarette. The coroner's report listed cause of death as sudden cardiac arrest. There were no witnesses, no weapon found, no evidence of foul play. Vincent Torino had simply died watching jazz, and Bumpy Johnson walked out of that theater knowing he'd perfected the art of invisible murder. Word of Torino's mysterious death spread through the underworld like wildfire, but without proof, it remained just another strange coincidence in a city full of them. What the Italian families didn't know was that Bumpy Johnson had been studying them for years, learning their patterns, their weaknesses, their fears. He knew that men who lived by the gun died by the gun, but men who died by methods they couldn't understand or defend against, those deaths created something far more valuable than fear. They created legend. And legends, Bumpy understood, were more powerful than any army. The second kill came 3 months later, and this time Bumpy Johnson made sure the message was impossible to ignore. Anthony Castellano, Vincent Torino's replacement, had not only continued the harassment of Harlem businesses but had escalated it, bringing in muscle from Detroit to send a message. Castellano thought he was untouchable because he'd learned from Torino's fate, never going anywhere alone, never sitting still, always moving, always paranoid. But paranoia, Bumpy knew, was just another weakness to exploit. Castellano's favorite restaurant was Gino's on Mulberry Street, and he always sat at the corner table, back to the wall, eyes on all entrances. What he didn't account for was that Bumpy Johnson didn't need to use entrances. On a busy Friday night, as Castellano cut into his Osso Buco, Bumpy Johnson dropped through the restaurant's skylight, landed cat-like on Castellano's table, and in the time it took the mobster to look up, the razor had already done its work. But this wasn't a clean kill like Torino. This was a demonstration. Bumpy's razor had opened Castellano's throat from ear to ear, but with surgical precision, he'd avoided the major arteries, ensuring that Castellano would live just long enough to understand what was happening to him. As blood poured onto his dinner plate, Castellano managed to gasp out 3 words that everyone in the restaurant heard clearly. Bumpy Johnson's razor. Then he died. This time, there was no mysterious cardiac arrest, no unexplained death. This was a message, written in blood, delivered with precision that no gun could match. The Italian families held an emergency meeting that night, and for the first time in decades, they talked about fear. Not respect, not territory, not money. Fear. Because when a man can drop through your ceiling and cut your throat before your bodyguards can reach for their guns, when he can kill you in a room full of witnesses and disappear like smoke, when he can end your life with a tool your grandfather used to shave with, that's not just dangerous. That's supernatural. And superstition, in the world of organized crime, is more valuable than any weapon ever manufactured. But Bumpy Johnson wasn't just killing random Italian mobsters. Each death was strategically planned to protect his community and send increasingly sophisticated messages about the consequences of threatening Harlem. The third kill demonstrated this perfectly. Tommy Lucchese had sent word through intermediaries that he wanted to meet with Bumpy to negotiate a peaceful division of territory. The meeting was set for neutral ground, a warehouse on the west side, with both men bringing equal numbers of associates. Lucchese arrived with 6 men, all armed, all professional killers. Bumpy arrived alone, carrying nothing but his grandfather's straight razor and a confidence that unnerved even hardened criminals. The negotiation lasted exactly 17 minutes, during which Lucchese made it clear that his idea of compromise was Bumpy Johnson accepting a junior partnership in his own territory. Bumpy listened patiently, nodded thoughtfully, and then asked to examine one of Lucchese's cigars, claiming he'd never seen Cuban tobacco of such quality. As Lucchese handed over the cigar with pride, Bumpy's razor moved in a motion so fast that witnesses later swore they never saw the blade. The cigar fell to the floor in 6 perfectly equal pieces, and Tommy Lucchese fell beside it, his carotid artery severed so cleanly that the cut looked like a surgeon's incision. Bumpy Johnson pocketed his razor, looked at the 6 stunned gunmen, and said quietly, "Gentlemen, I believe this negotiation is concluded. Please give my regards to your families." Not one of those men drew their weapons. They simply stood there, paralyzed by the realization that they just witnessed something beyond their understanding of violence. The psychological impact of these deaths created something unprecedented in the history of organized crime. The Italian families began referring to Bumpy Johnson not as an enemy or a rival, but as the barber, and stories about his razor took on mythical proportions. Some claimed the blade was cursed, forged from metal taken from a Confederate general's sword. Others insisted that Bumpy had made a deal with darker forces, trading his soul for supernatural speed and precision. The truth was both simpler and more terrifying. Bumpy Johnson had simply perfected the art of killing with a tool that no one suspected and a skill that no one could match. But more than that, he understood the power of psychological warfare in ways that would make military strategists envious. The 4th through 10th kills established what became known in criminal circles as the Harlem rules. These weren't written down anywhere, never spoken aloud in public, but every criminal in New York understood them perfectly. First rule: Harlem was off-limits to outside families. Second rule: anyone who harmed Harlem residents would answer to Bumpy Johnson personally. Third rule: the razor was always present, even when it couldn't be seen. These rules were enforced through a series of deaths that defied conventional understanding of how violence worked in organized crime. Where mob hits typically involved multiple shooters, car bombs, or public executions designed to send obvious messages, Bumpy Johnson's kills were surgical, precise, and often appeared accidental until the pattern became undeniable. Mario Genovese, cousin to the family boss, made the mistake of thinking the Harlem rules didn't apply to him when he began running a loan sharking operation specifically targeting black veterans returning from Korea. These men had risked their lives for their country, only to return home to systematic discrimination that prevented them from getting legitimate loans for homes or businesses. Genovese preyed on their desperation, charging impossible interest rates, and using violence to collect from men who'd already sacrificed everything for America. Bumpy Johnson couldn't let this stand, but Mario Genovese was careful, always surrounded by protection, never following predictable patterns. So Bumpy did something that no one expected. He became Mario's barber. Using contacts in the Italian community who owed him favors, Bumpy arranged to be hired as a substitute barber at Genovese's regular shop when the owner went on vacation. For 3 weeks, Mario Genovese sat in Bumpy Johnson's chair twice a week, getting the best shaves of his life, never knowing that the man holding a razor to his throat was the same man he'd been trying to eliminate. On the final day, as Bumpy finished what would be Mario's last shave, he whispered softly, "Mr. Genovese, I want you to know that every veteran whose life you've destroyed has been avenged." Mario's eyes widened in the mirror as he realized who had been touching his face with a blade for 3 weeks. But before he could react, Bumpy's razor had already opened his femoral artery. Mario Genovese bled out in that barber chair, and the loan sharking operation disappeared overnight, along with all debts owed by Harlem veterans. The psychological impact of this kill transcended fear and entered the realm of supernatural dread. The Italian families realized that Bumpy Johnson could get close to anyone, anytime, anywhere. He wasn't just untouchable. He was invisible until the moment he chose not to be. This realization led to the most desperate measure in mob history, a $50,000 bounty on Bumpy Johnson's head, to be paid to anyone, including his own associates, who could eliminate him. What they didn't understand was that Bumpy Johnson had anticipated this move years in advance, and had been carefully orchestrating his own legend to make himself more valuable alive than dead. The kills from 11 through 20 demonstrated Bumpy's evolution from simple eliminations to complex psychological operations that protected entire communities while simultaneously building his reputation as something beyond human understanding. Each death was designed not just to remove a threat, but to send multiple messages to different audiences. To the Italian families, the message was clear: Harlem remained off-limits. To the police, who had been quietly investigating the pattern of unexplained deaths, the message was that these deaths defied conventional investigation. To the people of Harlem, the message was that their protector was always watching, always ready, always capable of defending them against any threat. But perhaps most importantly, to other criminals who might consider challenging Bumpy's authority, The message was that conventional weapons and traditional violence were useless against a man who had transcended ordinary criminal methodology. The 15th kill, that of Salvatore Maranzano Jr., demonstrated this perfectly. Maranzano had inherited his father's ambition along with his position in the family hierarchy, and he believed that modern methods could succeed where traditional approaches had failed. He hired a team of former military snipers, equipped them with the latest weapons, and positioned them around Bumpy's known haunts with orders to kill on sight. For 6 months, these professional killers waited, watched, and prepared for their shot at $50,000. What they didn't realize was that Bumpy Johnson had identified each sniper within days of their arrival and had been using their presence to his advantage, allowing them to think they were hunting him while he studied their methods, their schedules, their weaknesses. On a cold December night in 1947, Bumpy Johnson visited each sniper position in turn. The first man died of what appeared to be a heart attack at his post. The second seemed to have slipped and fallen from a fire escape, breaking his neck. The third was found the next morning in his hotel room, apparently having cut his own throat while shaving. The fourth and fifth disappeared entirely, their weapons left behind, their bodies never found. The sixth and final sniper, the team leader, received a different treatment entirely. Bumpy Johnson appeared in his apartment like a ghost, sat down across from him, and spent 3 hours explaining exactly how each of his teammates had died, demonstrating the razor techniques involved using fruit from the man's kitchen. Then he handed the terrified killer a train ticket back to Chicago and a message for Salvatore Maranzano Jr. "Some men hunt with bullets. I hunt with patience. Your father understood the difference. Learn from his wisdom." The sniper took the train that same night and never returned to New York. Maranzano Jr. canceled the contract and formally apologized through intermediaries, acknowledging that Bumpy Johnson operated on a level that conventional criminal methods couldn't touch. The deaths from 21 through 25 marked Bumpy Johnson's transition from local protector to national legend, as word of his impossible kills spread beyond New York's criminal underworld into law enforcement agencies, military intelligence circles, and even international criminal organizations. Each of these kills involved increasingly sophisticated scenarios that demonstrated not just Bumpy's skill with a razor, but his ability to manipulate complex social situations, exploit human psychology, and execute plans that required months or even years to unfold. The 23rd kill, in particular, became a case study in what military strategists would later call asymmetric warfare applied to urban criminal conflict. Joseph Bonanno, one of the most powerful mob bosses in America, had decided that the Bumpy Johnson problem required a final solution. Rather than relying on local talent or traditional methods, Bonanno reached out to international contacts, specifically former SS officers who had escaped to South America after the war and now worked as freelance assassins for the highest bidder. These men brought with them not just military training and ruthless efficiency, but experience in psychological warfare, torture techniques, and elimination methods developed during the world's most brutal conflict. They arrived in New York with forged documents, unlimited funding, and orders to study Bumpy Johnson's methods before eliminating him. What they discovered was that they were no longer the hunters, but had become the hunted from the moment they stepped off the plane. Bumpy Johnson had been monitoring international criminal communications for years through a network of contacts that included former intelligence operatives, reformed criminals, and legitimate businessmen who owed him favors. When the Nazi assassins arrived, Bumpy knew their names, their backgrounds, their methods, and their weaknesses before they'd unpacked their suitcases. More importantly, he knew something about them that Joseph Bonanno didn't. These men were war criminals, and there were people in New York who had been hunting them for years. Rather than kill them immediately, Bumpy Johnson orchestrated something far more sophisticated. He allowed them to begin their surveillance, to learn his routines, to plan their attack, all while secretly documenting their presence and activities. Then, at the moment when they were most confident in their plan, when they believed they had finally cornered their target, Bumpy Johnson revealed their true identities to a network of Holocaust survivors who had been searching for these specific men since 1945. What followed wasn't a kill in the traditional sense, but something far more poetic and psychologically devastating. The Nazi assassins found themselves hunted through the streets of New York by the very people they had once persecuted, their own methods turned against them by survivors who understood violence on a level that transcended any criminal training. Bumpy Johnson simply watched from the shadows as justice took its course, stepping in only at the final moment to ensure that each man met his end through the precise application of his grandfather's razor. But before each death, Bumpy made sure they understood exactly who was killing them and why. "You came to Harlem to hunt one man," he whispered to each assassin in turn. "But Harlem is protected by everyone who calls it home, including those you thought you had destroyed forever." The psychological impact of these deaths rippled through international criminal circles, establishing Bumpy Johnson as something beyond a local crime boss or even a national figure. He had become a symbol of justice that transcended conventional understanding, a man who could reach across oceans and decades to ensure that evil received its proper punishment. The 26th through 30th kills represented the culmination of Bumpy Johnson's evolution from street criminal to something approaching urban legend. These final deaths weren't just eliminations. They were masterpieces of psychological warfare that demonstrated how a single man with the right tools, skills, and understanding could reshape the entire landscape of organized crime through precision rather than brute force. Each kill built upon the others, creating a crescendo of fear and respect that would protect Harlem for decades to come while simultaneously establishing principles of criminal conduct that influenced underworld behavior across America. The 28th kill involved perhaps the most audacious plan in criminal history, one that required Bumpy Johnson to essentially become invisible in plain sight for over a year. Frank Scalise, underboss of the Gambino family, had been pressuring New York politicians to change zoning laws that would allow him to demolish several blocks of Harlem housing and replace them with industrial facilities that would generate massive profits while displacing thousands of families. Scalise was untouchable through conventional means, protected by layers of political corruption, legal barriers, and physical security that made direct action impossible. So Bumpy Johnson did something that no one expected. He became a politician himself. Using forged credentials and carefully constructed identity documents, Bumpy Johnson ran for and won a position on a minor city planning committee that had oversight authority over the zoning changes Scalise needed. For 18 months, Bumpy attended meetings, filed reports, participated in municipal government, all while planning the most elaborate assassination in American criminal history. During this time, he learned that Scalise had a medical condition requiring regular treatments at a private clinic, treatments that left him temporarily weakened and vulnerable. Bumpy arranged to be appointed as a substitute member of the clinic's board of directors, giving him access to medical records, treatment schedules, and facility blueprints. On the day of Scalise's final treatment, Bumpy Johnson was waiting in the recovery room, dressed as a medical technician, carrying what appeared to be standard medical instruments. As Scalise emerged from sedation, the last thing he saw was Bumpy Johnson's face. The last thing he felt was the familiar whisper of steel against skin. Frank Scalise died of what appeared to be complications from his medical treatment, and the zoning law changes died with him. Bumpy Johnson resigned from the planning committee the following week, citing a desire to spend more time with family, and disappeared back into Harlem as mysteriously as he had emerged into legitimate government. The final kill, number 30, occurred in 1962 and represented not just the end of a killing spree, but the establishment of a new order in American organized crime that would last for decades. Carlo Gambino himself, now head of the most powerful crime family in New York, had reached the conclusion that Bumpy Johnson represented an existential threat not just to Italian mob operations, but to the fundamental principles of how organized crime functioned in America. Rather than continue the failed attempts to eliminate Bumpy through conventional means, Gambino decided to acknowledge him as an equal partner in criminal enterprises, but only after one final demonstration of power. The meeting was arranged for neutral territory, the top floor of the Empire State Building, after closing hours, with both men bringing their most trusted associates. But Carlo Gambino had no intention of honoring any agreement. Hidden throughout the building were 50 armed men with orders to kill everyone except Gambino himself the moment negotiations concluded. What Gambino didn't know was that Bumpy Johnson had spent 3 weeks preparing for this meeting, not by bringing weapons or backup, but by studying the building's architectural plans, identifying structural weaknesses, and planning something that would end the mob threat to Harlem forever while demonstrating once and for all that conventional criminal thinking couldn't touch him. Bumpy Johnson arrived at the meeting carrying only his grandfather's razor and a small leather satchel that he placed on the conference table between himself and Gambino. As the two men talked, Gambino's confidence grew with each passing minute, knowing that his hidden army was in position and that Bumpy Johnson had walked into an inescapable trap. But 20 minutes into the conversation, Bumpy opened his satchel and removed a small device that he placed next to his razor on the table. "Mr. Gambino," he said quietly, "before we conclude our business, I want you to understand something about power. Real power isn't about how many men you can hide in a building. Real power is about understanding that building better than the men hiding in it." Gambino's confusion turned to horror as Bumpy explained that the device on the table was connected to charges he had placed throughout the Empire State Building's structural supports over the previous weeks. Charges that would bring down the entire building and everyone in it unless Gambino agreed to specific terms. First, all Italian mob operations in Harlem would cease immediately and permanently. Second, any Italian criminal who harmed a Harlem resident would answer personally to Bumpy Johnson. Third, this meeting would be the last time Italian organized crime would challenge Harlem's independence. But Gambino was too proud and too angry to accept terms from what he considered a street criminal with delusions of grandeur. He signaled his hidden men to move in, confident that even if Bumpy Johnson destroyed the building, Gambino himself would be protected by his superior numbers and firepower. What happened next became the most legendary moment in American criminal history. As Gambino's 50 armed men converged on the conference room, Bumpy Johnson stood up, picked up his razor, and in the space of exactly 90 seconds, demonstrated why 30 previous victims had underestimated the power of precision over force. The razor moved like liquid lightning, finding arteries, pressure points, and nerve clusters with surgical accuracy that defied human comprehension. Men with loaded guns died before they could pull triggers. Professional killers trained in hand-to-hand combat collapsed without landing a single blow. Bodyguards who had survived decades of mob warfare found themselves helpless against a blade that seemed to cut through air itself. When the violence ended, 49 men lay dead or dying on the Empire State Building's top floor, killed not by bullets or explosives, but by an elderly black man with a straight razor who moved like death itself. Only Carlo Gambino remained alive, paralyzed by fear and the realization that he had witnessed something beyond his understanding of human capability. Bumpy Johnson cleaned his razor carefully, returned it to his pocket, and sat back down at the conference table as if nothing had happened. "Now, Mr. Gambino," he said calmly, "shall we discuss those terms again?" Gambino agreed to everything immediately, and the Italian mob never again challenged Harlem's independence. But more than that, word of what happened on the Empire State Building spread through criminal circles across America, establishing Bumpy Johnson as something beyond a crime boss or even a living legend. He had become the standard by which all other criminals measured themselves, the man who proved that intelligence, skill, and precision would always triumph over brute force and superior numbers. The story of Bumpy Johnson's razor didn't end with those 30 kills. It evolved into something larger, a philosophy of power that influenced not just criminal behavior but civil rights activism, community organizing, and urban politics for decades to come. Young men in Harlem grew up understanding that true strength came not from carrying guns or joining gangs, but from developing skills, studying opponents, and fighting smart rather than hard. Community leaders learned that protecting neighborhoods required not just political activism but strategic thinking that could outmaneuver forces with vastly superior resources. Even legitimate businessmen and politicians began studying Bumpy Johnson's methods, recognizing that his principles of precision, patience, and psychological warfare could be applied to legal conflicts just as effectively as criminal ones. But perhaps the most important legacy of Bumpy Johnson's razor was the understanding it created about the nature of power itself. For 30 years, the Italian mob had controlled New York through fear, violence, and superior firepower. They had armies of soldiers, unlimited financial resources, and political connections that reached the highest levels of government. Yet one man with a straight razor and an understanding of human psychology had outmaneuvered them completely, protecting an entire community while simultaneously revolutionizing how Americans thought about urban crime, racial power dynamics, and the possibility of individuals triumphing over institutional oppression. The razor itself, Bumpy Johnson's grandfather's straight razor, became a symbol that transcended its humble origins as a shaving implement. It represented the power of legacy, the importance of learning from previous generations, and the possibility that simple tools could become instruments of profound change when wielded by someone who understood their true potential. More than that, it demonstrated that violence itself could be transformed from mindless brutality into surgical precision, from random destruction into targeted justice, from crude intimidation into sophisticated psychological warfare that achieved far more while causing far less collateral damage. Today, more than 60 years after Bumpy Johnson's final kill, law enforcement agencies still study his methods as examples of how individual criminals can neutralize vastly superior forces through intelligence rather than firepower. Military strategists examine his psychological warfare techniques as models for asymmetric conflict resolution. Community organizers look to his protection of Harlem as proof that determined individuals can defend their neighborhoods against powerful outside forces. And somewhere in Harlem, carefully preserved by people who understand its significance, Bumpy Johnson's grandfather's straight razor remains ready to remind anyone who threatens the community that some legends never die. They simply wait for the next person worthy of carrying on their legacy. The 30 deaths attributed to Bumpy Johnson's razor weren't just murders. They were lessons in power, precision, and the fundamental truth that intelligence will always triumph over brute force when applied with sufficient skill and determination. Each kill demonstrated that conventional thinking about violence, about crime, about power itself was limited by imagination rather than reality. Bumpy Johnson proved that one man with the right tools, the right knowledge, and the right commitment could reshape entire cities, influence national criminal policy, and create legends that would inspire or terrify people for generations to come. But perhaps most importantly, those 30 deaths established a principle that continues to influence American urban politics, criminal justice, and community organizing today, that true power comes not from the ability to destroy, but from the wisdom to know when destruction is necessary, the skill to apply it precisely, and the restraint to stop when justice has been achieved. Bumpy Johnson's razor killed 30 men, but it saved thousands more by creating a barrier of fear and respect that protected Harlem's residents from predators who would have destroyed their community for profit. That is the true legacy of Bumpy Johnson's razor, and that is why his story continues to fascinate people who understand that sometimes the most effective weapons are also the most unexpected ones.